Welcome back to the Flow State podcast. We are your hosts
Monica Groney.
and Nora Candido. So excited for today's episode. We have a special guest on with us, and we will let her introduce herself here.
Hello, everyone. I'm Mandy Rother, also known as the PMDD dietitian.
Yeah, I'm so excited to have Mandy on today. Mandy is one of the Maria medical advisors alongside Nora. And Mandy and I connected on PMDD because it is obviously, as I've talked about before on the podcast, something that I experience and something that Mandy not only specializes in, but that she has also had a lot of experience herself with. So, Mandy, do you want to maybe just share a little bit about your experience, your diagnosis with PMDD, and how that kind of led you from being an RD into being an RD that focuses on PMDD?
Yeah, I was reflecting on like my PMDD story, and I feel like when you're on podcasts, you're talking with clients about it. I was like, I started likening it to like different ex-boyfriends of the past, and I'll explain what I mean by that. Of like, I feel like the way PMDD has showed up in my life has been like, let's say this like volatile relationship that you just want to forget about, and then sometimes it's been a more subdued like challenge, and it's just showed up in different parts of my life in different ways. And I think, for me, I was diagnosed pretty early on, like back in college in my early 20s. And at that time, it was I feel like I was like that type A, high achiever, everything at 150%. And then all of a sudden my world would fall apart, and it would be like self hatred, doubting myself, doubting my choices, doubting my actual boyfriends and relationships at that time. And then all of a sudden I'd be back on top of my game, and it would repeat over and over again. And so at that time, my story is probably like a lot of the listeners, where it was a bunch of different medications, antidepressants, and SSRIs, different types of birth control, and standard treatments. And then, I was left feeling like kind of out of options, like feeling worse. And those things would help initially. I'd get some relief and kind of, feel like everything was back on track. And then the benefits would kind of wane over time, and I'd be left feeling like, okay, what's next? What do I try? And out of standard treatments. And that was during my time where it was probably even before I decided to be a dietitian. And then even as I became a dietitian and was working as one, I still felt like I was kind of left to just conventional medicine and standard options. And then I hit, everyone has their rock bottom moment in like early in my career, where everything just kind of crashed, and I had to take medical leave due to PMDD, and probably more so like anxiety and depression combined with PMDD, and this, the perfect storm of things. And that is when I actually started studying the functional medicine side of nutrition and became really passionate about that. And it was my own experience finally finding, after like, decades of like searching for answers, of like finding this more comprehensive model that actually not just like dug me out of that place, but I actually felt like I was, thriving and able to live with some of these cyclical changes and reduce the symptoms overall. So that just led to almost like an obsession with studying all of this and and I worked as a dietitian in other capacities for many, many years after that. And it was just in the last few years that I've been primarily focused in working with clients, like pretty much primarily with PMDD and then other conditions too. So it's morphed over time as I've dug deeper and deeper into it.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So I have so many questions off of that. But first, I just want to share with our audience, for anyone listening who is like, what the heck is PMDD?
Yes. So PMDD is premenstrual dysphoric disorder. And really a good question to ask, because even, doctors or health practitioners sometimes aren't familiar with it, and awareness is really growing. And so, I know, Monica, you've shared a bit on the podcast about your journey with it, but a lot of times people will refer to it like PMS on steroids or severe PMS, but it's really quite different. The causes, like the physiological underlying causes, are very different. It's actually like a hormone-based cellular disorder in the brain with a lot of research behind it. And there's both the psychological symptoms, not just the physical symptoms of PMS. So really kind of a big difference that differentiates the two.
Yeah, and one of the things that I feel like to me stood out the most when I was learning about it is that you can have PMS and PMDD, and like your hormones can be quote unquote in balance, which we've talked about before. It's just like a ratio, it's not a real balance, whatever. And you can still have PMDD. So it's more of like a sensitivity even to normal hormone fluctuation. Is that kind of on point?
Yes, and there can be both things happening at once. And a lot of times, or some people even talk about that it's caused by hormonal imbalance, which isn't really correct. But I do see time and time again that they can coexist. Someone can say, let's say have a thyroid based hormone issue, or they could have PCOS also happening with PMDD, but that doesn't mean it's the direct cause. It's likely exacerbating it. So the normal hormonal fluctuations that happen throughout the entire menstrual cycle, and that's from like your period bleed until you bleed again, the hormones are going up and down, the levels of estrogen and progesterone, and that shifts, some of the metabolites that can be created impact the brain. So, and there's shifts in brain chemicals, and it's the person's brain that has PMDD that's really sensitive to those hormone fluctuations. So the hormones don't necessarily have to be off for that to happen.
And does the brain play a role in PMS as well, or is it primarily just those who experience PMDD?
I think it's at just a much different level. So like with PMS or in the menstrual cycle overall, there's, let's say, these little kind of a little roller coaster ride of estrogen. And as that estrogen goes down, so do our brain chemicals that also need to be in balance with one another. Things like serotonin that make us feel calm and at peace, balanced, dopamine, which is like our reward, pleasure hormone. Those things go down as estrogen go down. And I think of estrogen as like the accommodating kind of nicey nice hormone that as that goes down, sometimes so do some of those emotions and that level of resilience. So there can be and should be shifts where at times we may feel more social, more outgoing, and times where we're going to feel a little bit more withdrawn in whether someone has PMS or not. That's supposed to happen where we feel a bit different throughout the cycle. But in PMDD, it's a whole different ball game. There's and there can be genetic influences and other things that create that perfect storm that happens. But it's at a whole nother level of impact on someone's life and the debilitating symptoms that can come out from it. So rather than feeling, let's say, a little bit irritable, which could happen with PMS, it could be like major interpersonal conflict or rage or anger, or it can come out as depression, super low self-esteem. Even for a lot of people, they can experience really intrusive, like scary thoughts, and kind of this thought spiral, and even suicidal ideation can happen with it. So there's quite a big difference, I would say.
I'm curious, in receiving on the earlier side, which is awesome, like what were some things that you were even expressing to your provider, and how were they like, oh, this is absolutely PMDD? And I'm wondering, what getting that diagnosis, do you feel like it changed your outlook or your treatment options or your perspective on things? What did that look like?
Yeah, it was, actually came from the outside. My mom she like came to expect like a call at certain times of the month of like, yep, she's doing fine, she's doing fine. Okay, here's my phone call. Like, I want to leave college, like nothing's right. Like, and so, she helped me identify the cyclical pattern. And then it was, I'm so grateful for this, the psychologist at my college that helped me identify like what was going on. And I even looking back, I'm like, oh, I wonder if, my mom experienced this. There can kind of run in families. But I think the diagnosis at that time, like being so young, I think there was a degree of relief knowing, but also like hopelessness of like, it felt like a pretty heavy thing to sort through. Like, oh, this isn't just something I'm going through right now. This is a diagnosis. And it had a feeling of like permanence of like, oh, I'm going to be struggling with this for a long time. So I think it took me a while to sort through of like what that actually meant. And I see that with a lot of my clients too, where they receive the diagnosis and either, kind of one of two things happens. Either they hear it and it's like, it feels kind of like I was saying, this like big thing of like, where do I start? This feels so heavy. It can feel hopeless. Or they go right into like problem solving mode of like, let me do a deep dive on the internet and learn everything I can. And both can feel really, really overwhelming. So like if anyone's at that point of like trying to get diagnosed or recently diagnosed, I just encourage you to like take a minute, like, pause and like just let it settle and just like acknowledge the weight of that and sometimes the pain of that and what you've been experiencing, and also to experience some of the relief too of like sometimes we rush right past of like, oh, there's like 1 in 20 people who have periods are experiencing this, that you're not alone in that, there's a name for that. And so sometimes we just want to jump to the next step where just kind of sitting with it for a little bit. If I could go back, I probably would have told myself that at that young age.
Yeah, I want to dive in a little bit more into that like diagnosis process for anyone listening that you'd said, is going through that right now. But I really quickly wanted to ask you on your experience. You'd said that, you'd been experiencing some of the emotional side. Your mom obviously noticed it. Had you had any prior diagnosis of something that wasn't PMDD, or that, you've continued to experience alongside PMDD on the mood side, like anxiety, depression? A lot of people I hear, me personally, I thought I was bipolar. There's a lot of obviously mood disorders that can kind of live alongside it, or that you can think that you had, and in reality, what you're experiencing is PMDD. Was that there for you at all?
Yeah, I think at that point, if I remember, like I already had a diagnosis of depression and anxiety. And so it was like, okay, why does it all of a sudden get worse? And it sounds like once you're like, oh, why didn't I like recognize that before? And then I think for me, even at that point when I went on birth control, and this isn't the case for everyone, for some people birth control can be effective. For me, it made things worse. And then it wasn't, cyclical symptoms. I just felt depressed all the time, like zombie, and it intensified things. But yeah, I did have the coexisting conditions at the same time. And that the term for that is it's PME, premenstrual exacerbation, and super, super common. And it's not just depression, anxiety that can coexist with PMDD. There's super common, and I hope that research continues to develop on this, ADHD, borderline personality disorder, bipolar, addiction, lots of different things can coexist. So super common that there's not just one thing going on. In my early 20s, I received a diagnosis of PCOS. And I think, that was actually, in my opinion, and from what I noticed with my like labs before and after the birth control I was on at that time, was driven by the birth control I was on. That was like creating that hormonal situation for me. But that really intensified my symptoms too. So sometimes it's like a mixed soup of like other things going on with like a shared like kind of, root cause of what's driving that.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for digging into that. I think oftentimes, I know for me, like I don't really experience the anxiety or depression symptoms other than just before my period, which, was just kind of crazy to have that realization and be like, oh, like I am not depressed, 30 days out of the month. It's really just this like time period just before my period that I get really, really low. And for me, the diagnosis was definitely like relief in a way. And it was a starting point. So I think it's different for everyone, but it is really interesting how there can be coexisting things, or even misdiagnosis, or like misdiagnosis by yourself. I went screaming to my doctor that I was bipolar. So
Yeah. Well, and I will say too, my experience, like I said, like it's like different boyfriends of the past has been different at different times. So before, when I had PMDD in like my earlier 20s, it felt like a very like low, dark depression, kind of the and for me personally, I would experience the like really like scary thoughts that felt like they came out of nowhere, a sense of isolation of like, oh my gosh, I don't even want to get out of bed. And then, there were shifts in my health, sometimes, things surrounding pregnancy or other hormonal shifts where I had other experiences of PMDD where it was more of the heightened type of like the anxiety, the irritability, the rage, that just like feeling of like inner tension. And so those are like two very different experiences of the same condition that, and for me, because I work in this field, I can identify like, oh, like there were other things that shifted in my physiology that were creating these different symptoms. But I think that's important to know with all the different life stages we go through. For someone, for example, with, whether it's, puberty, if it starts that early for someone, pregnancies and breastfeeding, and then even in the perimenopausal years, their experience of the same condition can really change. And those symptoms can actually give us really helpful information on like, okay, what do we do about it then? It can give us some clues of like what's happening, as far as like potential root factors.
And is that true as well that, someone who didn't have this in their 20s could maybe have a hormonal change, like having a child, and then when they get their period back, all of a sudden they are experiencing maybe what is PMDD? Is that something that can happen?
100%, yeah. I've seen just in the people I work with, I've seen pregnancy for some people act as a bit of a reset. Of course, like during pregnancy, you're not ovulating, your hormones are stable. A lot of people feel great during pregnancy, and there can be a lot of fear of what's going to happen after if they've already been experiencing it before. And I think, I've seen some people where they get some relief after pregnancy, and like it's like this like hormonal reset, in their body, and for some people it can get or it can pop up, like you said, after a pregnancy. And there can be, and that's where it's really important to look at. For me, I bring in a lot of like blood work and lab data to determine like, okay, what created that shift? Is there anything else we need to uncover that's happening as well? That's why your body and brain are doing that at this point.
Yeah, super interesting. So it can kind of go either way. It can pop up, it can maybe like diminish or so yeah, that I feel like it's an uncontrollable thing. Although we can find control. So maybe that was the wrong message, but
Rewind.
yeah.
Well, and just to add another layer, like I'll see even throughout the year, people seasonally will have a different experience of the condition where, let's say if they also have seasonal affective disorder or SAD or the winter blues, they might have a different experience of their PMDD symptoms than in the summer. Or, with allergies, for example, allergy season, I'll see sometimes a heightened, the more irritability, anxious components of PMDD related to the histamine connection, which is a whole big topic. But so even throughout the year, there can be changes within a given person too. So that's where it's really important to just know yourself, know your body, and know your cycles, so you can start to put those pieces together.
Yeah, I'm so glad you touched on that, especially this time of year. I know where I live, it's dark out way, way more this time of year, and seasonal change is so real. So I'm super happy that you said that.
Is there a
Sitting with my
tracker
sun
that
lamp, looking out at the snow before we hopped on our recording.
Is there a tracker, Mandy, that you really like to use with your clients? Something that like you can check in on your mood every day and where you are in your cycle, or for people that, they haven't even thought that this could be a possibility until they're hearing some of these signs and symptoms in this episode today. Like, where do you even recommend that people start? Or if they want to go and have a conversation with their provider, like, do they need to be bringing evidence? Like, what are some of those conversations looking like with your clients?
Yeah, good question. And so to receive a diagnosis, if someone's at that point, the doctor or the OB or the psychiatrist will require 2 months of cycle tracking to look at those patterns. and getting a diagnosis can be surprisingly like elusive. So I hear, and just for people to know, they're not alone if they're in that place where someone will come like, I think I have PMDD, or my provider told me I probably likely maybe have PMDD, but they like didn't put it in my chart. Super common, and there's a lot of things that play into that. But so if that's you, you're not alone. And even if that diagnosis has been a bit elusive, that doesn't mean you can't start taking action. And I do think that first action is tracking cycles, and whether to receive a diagnosis or just to learn more about your body and your cycles. And so there's a lot of tracking options. And what I find with my clients is sometimes they feel a bit overwhelmed by all the options. Like, do I track my basal body temperature? Do I use an app? Do I not use an app? And so I created one that is simplified. And so, I recommend, choosing just a handful of primary symptoms, the ones that impact you the most. And it could be, for example, a mix of the mental emotional symptoms. Maybe your top ones are, rage and anger, depression, and, self-criticism, for example. And then even some of the physical symptoms that can happen, oftentimes with, breast tenderness and things like that. But choosing the ones that have the biggest impact and then rating the severity. Because I think when you know the severity and how that's changing, not just like, did I have the symptom or not, actually if the things that you're doing and taking action on are making a dent, or if they're leading to a shift in those symptoms. So I like to track, like, what are we changing the symptoms and the severity, like, side by side, and that way we know, like, what's working, what do you keep doing, what's not working, what do we toss to the side, so we can prioritize other action steps.
I think it's really helpful for people too to reflect, because you live with yourself every single day, and if you have positive or negative shifts in either direction, it's hard to remember where you started if you're not keeping track. So especially when it comes to mood things, or for me it's a lot of digestive things for people, and they often say, I didn't realize how good I was feeling until I had an episode or something. So when we start to track things, this information, it's a data point for me, but it also acts as this living journal. So you can look back and say, wow, I'm so much better than I was a month ago, 6 months ago, a year ago, and have that kind of baseline information. I see it so powerful.
Yeah, and that's such a good point. Like, when you're in the thick of it, and even if you're moving in the right direction, it can be sometimes hard to actually feel that and to know that without looking back. Or even to remember like how it used to be. Like, it's almost like a degree of amnesia, like you don't even want to remember that. And then I think on the other side, in which I'm sure will be talked about a lot on this podcast, is there can be some really beneficial and positive shifts throughout the cycle. And so I also encourage the people I work with to check in on some of those things, like not just thinking about symptoms, but what are the sensations in my body that are shifting? What are the emotional shifts? When do I feel creative and productive? When do I feel more playful? When do I feel more confident and sexy? Those sorts of things. And that way the cycle and, these changes aren't the enemy. It's like, oh, wow, I'm this like kind of fluid, person that I change. I'm this cyclical person that I'm not the same every day. And we learn how to harness that. And that's where I really see there's just like this inner shift that happens with people with PMDD, or just people with periods in general, of like, oh, this isn't something that I dread. I actually look forward to, like, and I think I told you about this, Monica, when I'm breastfeeding twins, but I had my period back, and before my period was back, I was like, I kind of missed my period, which would sound crazy, like, to someone suffering from PMDD, knowing that I have a history of that, but I missed the little reminders to like stop and pause and reflect, of having this almost like inner compass of like, when do I feel like going out dancing? When do I feel like staying home? So I think that's important too with tracking, to bring some of those things back in.
It's a nice reminder too for you to say, for us to take note of the positives and the negatives, because those positives are also huge data points when we're cycle tracking. Like, if our sex drive is higher, or we are feeling more outgoing or more creative, those are all signals of different phases of our cycle as well. So when we are kind of tracking our symptoms, I think a lot of times we think about tracking the negatives, but the positives are just as much data points as the negatives. So if you aren't someone who's been tracking your cycle and you think that you're experiencing PMDD, some of those positives can also help you pinpoint if the negatives are correlated with that luteal phase of your cycle. So I feel like that was like a really good call out, Mandy, for you to just have that reminder to people that it's not all about the negatives. And when we see the whole picture, the positives, the ups and the downs, we really get much more in tune with the seasonal beings that we are every month.
Yeah. Well, and I think the other thing is it helps you keep a pulse on that diagnosis doesn't become your identity. Like you're so much more than these symptoms. And Nora, like with your specialty in digestion, maybe you see this too of like when someone just so desperately wants to feel better and the digestive symptoms or PMDD symptoms or whatever it may be are just plaguing them every day. Sometimes that feels like all you can see becomes all you are. You're focusing on getting rid of that thing. And so just to be able to touch into all these different facets of who you are and see that on paper or in an app or whatever you're using, I think is powerful too. I know for me for a while, I got lost in the diagnosis feeling like kind of consumed by it, that like it was just something wrong with me. I was broken and it was like never going to go away, like in those younger years. And so I became really passionate about helping people just like kind of stay grounded in who they are with and in addition to the diagnosis.
It really applies to so much. I'm even sitting here thinking, like, as someone who's trying to conceive, you like start to think, like, oh, it didn't happen again this month. Like, something's wrong with me. And it's like, we focus on the thing that we want or the change that we want. It just like becomes the sticky point. So to be able to see beyond that and the other sides of it, I think super, super important. Okay, so I want to kind of move. You talked about people tracking and bringing some of that data to their doctors, tracking as they're kind of making changes and in that sense. But what if someone's in a position where they go to their doctor and they're like, I think I have PMDD. Here's the data that I have. And, a lot of traditional doctors, and maybe you can just touch on this, like, don't fully understand PMDD. Maybe they don't have a lot of tools in their toolbox. And I feel like the first option that they give a lot of people, and this is probably because, research has shown that Yaz, a type of birth control, is the only birth control that is, I don't know, certified, approved for PMDD. They kind of just like, that's the tool they have.
Yeah.
And so they give people Yaz and say, like, this is what's going to help you. What options do people have at that point to kind of make a change that maybe isn't that, or should they try birth control? Like, what, I know you can't really tell people what they should or shouldn't do, but what are your thoughts on that next step?
Yeah, I would say like for someone, let's say preparing for that type of appointment, doing some reflection before, or even if you're there or it's already happened, giving yourself the right and the space to take time with that decision so you can make an informed choice. Because there are other options, and that's often what happens of, there's SSRIs, so a type of antidepressant, and birth control, and those are your two options. And if those haven't worked, like, good luck. And so, like, I think for me, some of my passion is driven from opening up the doors to more options so people have more choice. And so, like I said, just, being really grounded in that, right, that you don't have to. And I've had many, many clients, they take the prescription because they're not sure. And then they wait to take it, or keep the conversation going with their doctor. And it's, of course, a really personal decision, and a decision that should be made with someone's, primary care physician or their OB. But I think just to know that there are other things that you can do, or sometimes it's a combined approach. And, even though I work in this functional medicine world and, holistic world, I'm not the type to say like medications don't have a place. They have a place. And for some people they work, and some people need that and the other stuff. And so it's really finding that path for you, and knowing that there's always more doors to open and explore. And I think what happens often is it's like single problem, like single diagnosis, and this is just how Western medicine works. And here's your single solution. And like, as a child, for example, I had severe reflux, and it was like, okay, you have acid reflux. Here's your antacid, and like stay on it for a decade. Whoops. And Nora, I know that's like making you cringe, but our bodies are not that simple, and PMDD can be complex, and so we need a multifaceted approach, a more holistic approach, whether someone chooses birth control or meds or not.
I so agree with that. And the conversation that I like to have with clients is that it can be a bridge. It doesn't have to be the solution. Like, it's a tool. And if that just relieves some of the pressure and allows you to focus your energy and your efforts elsewhere to really address the underlying issues, like if your mood is feeling better, maybe you feel like moving your body more, and maybe it helps to improve your sleep and your relationships and all of those things. I call it an upward spiral. Like, it's going to create this positive compounding effect, and that can free up the energy and the space for us to then do the deep work and dig and treat the underlying things, and incorporate more of those supportive habits that maybe in the future you feel comfortable enough coming off of those tools. Right? And I think it can be really helpful.
Yeah, I've had two conversations just this week, like the exact conversation with a couple clients on this hard decision of like, do I do that? And when someone's really really suffering, sometimes you do need that little leg up to be able to have the capacity to do the other components of healing, and there's nothing wrong with that. I think it's just knowing, and that's where tracking again is important, to say, okay, if I'm making this decision, did it help? Did I feel better after, let's say, starting birth control? Did anything get worse? And that way that you know what's playing a role in how things are shifting.
Exactly.
I think on the, patient side, being the non-practitioner in the room, like, I feel like, we hear these conversations around like medication isn't the only option. And Mandy, you touched on the functional side of things, and how, there are other options. And maybe, Nora, I love how you said that the medication can maybe be the bridge and allow you the space to work on the other things. But I think the other things, I'm air quoting for anyone not watching, it's just such a gray area that then you get overwhelmed, and a lot of times your OB or your primary care doctor can't necessarily help you with the other things because that's not their zone of genius. They also just don't have the time to work with patients individually on these functional, nutritional, other things. So for someone feeling like, I want to do the other things, but I don't know what they are or where to start or how, and it is intimidating to think about working with a dietitian or a practitioner who's not covered by my health insurance. Like, I'm just kind of curious, what are some of the tools or things people can do who are like, I want the other things, but I am confused.
Yeah, that's real, right? And there's like,
Oh, Nora, are you still there?
I am.
Is she talking?
No, it's frozen on my end too.
Same time. And that's oftentimes what I hear is like, are you guys frozen?
Oh, maybe just give it a second. You were frozen for a second. I think you're there now. Okay. Maybe just start over what you were saying with there's not enough information, but you said something like that.
yeah. Well, they'll know where to edit, right?
Yeah.
Do you, Monica, want me to go over like specific starting points?
Um,
Or what do you, with your question, wanting to?
I don't know. I think I'm just curious because I was that person that was like, I don't know how to start with the other things or like what to do. And so maybe just kind of highlight some of the areas that people can be thinking about, and then we can just say like we're going to dive deeper into some of these other things in other episodes. But I think just kind of give like an overview of what some of those other things are, and maybe like if there's anything someone could start on without the lifestyle things.
Yeah. Okay. Hopefully your internet is saying it's
That's okay. My internet always does this, but everyone's recorded individually so they can like piece it together.
all right. Now I'm trying to think of your question to start again.
So it's just explaining like what some of these gray area other things are and how someone can kind of go in that direction if that's what they're interested in.
Yeah. Yeah, such a good question, and I think there's so much information out there. There's so many different options that it can feel paralyzing. And a lot of times people start, like we were talking about, that deep internet dive, and all of a sudden they're reading about all these different nutrition things, and that conflicts, and which supplements to take, and then or do I do acupuncture, or do I need to start therapy or a different therapist? And I don't know if that's kind of what you experience, Monica, but it's like, where do I start? Like, what's going to help? And I think, I just encourage like anyone feeling in that place to just, again, like pause and just reestablish that trust with yourself. That oftentimes we know, or we will find that next step. And there's so many options, like I said, with, sometimes it is the nutritional piece and finding the way of eating that's really supportive of your health and bringing in supplements strategically with that. Sometimes it is, meditation and yoga and mind body movement, or acupuncture. And so, like I said, just kind of pause and ask yourself, like, what do I need right now? And the only goal being like, what is my next, like, baby step with that? And I think and I see this time and time, even if someone's identified like, I want to do this whole functional approach, we still have to take it really, really slow. And so when you're in the height of symptoms, like having really realistic and graceful expectations of yourself, of like just any tiny baby step, and that might be just like, I'm going to go outside every day, I'm going to go for a walk, and reconnect with something that brings me joy and hope. And so there's a lot of different places to start. And so, and we've talked a lot about tracking today. I think as you're tracking and getting to know yourself and your body and your cycle, find like, what do I need? I think is the next piece with that. And then creating your team of support, and that may look different for different people. For some people they need to start with therapy, and for other people they need to start with on the functional side, or even going to a yoga studio or whatever it may be. But just starting really, really small, like tiny, I think is the best approach.
Yeah, I'm curious if you would share maybe like it sounded like you started with a therapist in college. That's how you got your diagnosis. And you tried birth control and SSRIs. But on the more functional other things side, what were some of the first steps that you took that you really felt like you noticed a difference with?
Yeah, for me, it was gathering data to figure out what I needed, some lab testing. And I realized that I had mentioned like I was on the digestive related medications for years. And I think that combined with my digestive issues and maybe my genetics, I was super depleted in certain nutrients, and I was active. I was playing sports in college, and exercising quite a bit, and just, stressed to the max, like, working and all the things. I think I was just super depleted with nutrients. And so I think for me, it was the start was optimizing that and giving myself the nutrients I needed, both from food and supplementing wisely. And so I think, and oftentimes even just changing your diet can feel like we're talking about one thing of the many things, and that it can be such a huge piece of the puzzle. And of course, all of us here are passionate about the nutrition side, but That's where I do think when we're talking about that bridge or that leg up, where even just starting a really, really high quality multivitamin can be a game changer. It's not going to be, a magic pill or anything like that or an overnight cure. But when I started to realize, like, oh, this is how I'm supposed to feel. Like, this is how I feel when I have enough nutrients in my body. This is how I feel when for me, I actually was able to identify some foods that were contributing to my digestive issues. And then also the mind body connection of how much stress was impacting my digestion. Those were some of like the very first steps where I'm like, okay, this is what I should feel like in my body. And it gave me enough capacity and even energy, like actual physical energy, to keep doing some other things. But that set the foundation for me.
Yeah, I can relate to so much of that. And I mean, it's why Maria exists today, is that nutrition was the bridge for me. Like starting to supplement, high quality, the right forms, the right levels was really the thing that allowed me the space to heal like as a whole. And I think my biggest fear with putting a supplement out into the world has been that people are going to think that it is this magic fix and it's like a single, you know, piece approach, and that we're saying like this is going to fix you. And in the long run it's like, no, it's just like it has this ability to let you see how you can feel, and then give you the space to take other steps as well. So it's just a piece of the puzzle, but one for me that was like the piece. And it sounds like for you, it was one of those initial pieces as well. So that's really cool to hear.
Yeah, and I think with, in the functional medicine world, and Nora, maybe you would agree, I think sometimes the danger with that is people want to jump to the most complex thing. And we brought up histamine, for example, before. We'll talk about that hopefully in another episode. But, let's say we want to jump to like, okay, this is a histamine intolerance thing. Well, guess what? That starts with nutrients and making sure you have the nutrients that you need to actually control the histamine situation and make the enzymes that break it down. And so all this stuff connects. And so if we just go to and I see this a lot with supplements, someone will be taking mood enhancing supplements, which can be very effective. And sometimes they'll bring those in, like people will take St. John's wort or 5-HTP or specific amino acids. They can be game changers. But if you do that without nutrients, your brain and your body can't do with those things what they're supposed to. So we really have to start at the foundational level. Otherwise, anything you do won't be effective. Another thing I'll hear is that someone will, let's say, take out dairy, which can also be effective. But if you do that and you do nothing else, you're going to be like, well, this dairy-free life is not super fun. And it's not going to get you as complete of relief if you haven't done the foundational things of, let's say eating enough. Under eating, I find, is super common. Yes. Or irregular eating patterns, and then optimizing nutrients. Anything else you do beyond that is not going to be as effective long term.
Yeah, I can attest to the eating enough thing. I just started like tracking protein, and just getting enough protein, it means I'm eating more calories, and it's like literally game changing for like just my mood and like brain fog and not feeling like a total like loop-de roller coaster all day. So the calories thing is real. Yeah.
Blood sugar balance is, I would say, number one or two that I do with clients, of like your plate, figuring out like how often you should eat and eating enough. Huge.
Yeah.
I think
Super
the big
cool.
thing for me is that the other things, or taking this more holistic approach, it is super individualized. And instead of just trial and error, working with somebody like Mandy, like this is your specialty. If you are in this world day in and day out and you know these things, that's going to help somebody feel so much more confident about me, and having trust in a provider that you've had the experience yourself. You know what has worked for others. You can help them to find those tools that are going to move the dial for them. But I think, everything in nutrition, but is super individualized. And I think that's why it might also be hard when you go to a provider and it's like, here are some other things. It's not just the one thing. And I think it's not the one thing for everybody. So finding those things that work for you and solve your personal puzzle is really the key.
Yeah, and I think, gosh, I want to share a pet peeve of mine. I think sometimes I'll get a new client and they're filling out their intake forms, and obviously they're seeing me because what they've tried already hasn't worked. They're still suffering, and I'll get a list of like 20 supplements. Maybe some of you are thinking about like the buckets and buckets of supplements, and it could even be from another provider where, and I'll ask like, so tell me about like your plan and what you've tried already, and they'll just send me the list of supplements, and I'll be like, is that it? Like, like no other changes, no mind body connection or even diet changes. And so I think just be aware of that, even, here with Monica as the founder of Maria, like supplements have a role, but they can't be used alone. So I think that is like my professional pet peeve. But I've also found like, so I'm someone who like kind of, science nerd. I love to do everything as individualized as possible. And at the same time, I think there are foundational pieces that like help everyone. Like we all just kind of like lit up about eating enough and blood sugar balance. Like, those are the things where, making sure we can do that. But even in that might be different for each person of like,
Right.
someone could benefit from intermittent fasting while someone else that's going to just wreck their hormones and wreck their mood. And we have to align it with our lives and our daily schedule. So even the things that are foundational, we got to get that support and figure out how to individualize them to make them actually happen in real life.
Yeah, so important. Such a good reminder. So I really want to dig into the histamine side of things and genetics. And I think we're going to do that in another episode because there is enough to cover just on those things as it relates to PMDD on its own. So we're going to have Mandy back and talk about those things. So stay tuned for that. But I'd love to kind of just wrap up today, Mandy, with a little lightning round, which I didn't prepare you for. So hopefully we can fire these off and you have some answers for us. But this is something that I like to do with our guests, just so people a little bit. They're kind of fun. But okay, feeling ready?
Those videos that people post on social media where they like follow a celebrity around their house and ask them questions.
I haven't seen those, so I don't know, but
oh my God, what is she going to ask me? Okay.
No, okay. Question number 1, what is your favorite way to de-stress?
Going in my sauna.
Oh, what? That sounds amazing. I wasn't expecting that. I thought you were going to say salsa dancing, but
Oh, that too, but I only like feel like I'm in the mood to do that these days in my like mom life, like once a month. I used to dance every day, but that's not happening anymore.
Is there a book that has changed your life?
Ooh. Gosh, I think for me, it's just reading in general. Like, I have like an insane amount of books that I can't stop buying. I buy more books than I can read. And so I'm like obsessed with murder mystery novels. And so that's my favorite thing to do in my luteal phase of like escape and like read. And then I also have all my like science, functional nutrition books. So I think just being able to both escape in a book and learn from a book. Mm-hmm.
Sounds like maybe a little form of self-care.
Yes.
Love that. Okay, last question is, what is your favorite meal to cook?
Ooh, I love like Mediterranean food. I used to live in the Middle East for I lived there for a year, and I love the food. So, and my husband is Mexican, so I eat a lot of Mexican food. So it feels like it contrasts that, and I get to have something different. So sometimes I'll go and buy new spices and try to replicate and make something that I, tried there.
Sounds delicious. Amazing. Well, Mandy, thank you so much for joining us today. How can our listeners find you and how could they potentially work with you if they're interested?
Yeah, so my website you can put in your show notes, but it's revealfunctionalnutrition.com. But if you just Google my name, Mandy Rother, and PMDD, you'll find me very easily. And I work both one-on-one with people on that highly individualized level, and also with groups. Or sometimes a hybrid of the two. And something I've become really passionate about is creating communities around this, because we shouldn't be doing this alone. We were never meant to do it alone. So, yeah, that's how you find me.
Awesome. Thanks, Mandy. We are so happy that you joined us. And for anyone listening today, if you found this episode helpful or you enjoyed listening, make sure you hit that subscribe button so that you get notified when new episodes go live. And feel free to leave us a review. We love reading your reviews.
Thank you, Mandy.
All right, bye.
We'll see you guys next week.